Hello and welcome to Dispatch Live. It's the first day of August, which in Washington, D.C. is often known as the dumbest month of the year. Congress is out of session, but it's going to be a little bit newsier this year, I would say. Joining me tonight right now is David Drucker, a senior editor at the Dispatch, and we will have Mary Trimble and Audrey Fallberg joining along the way over the course of the next hour here. We're obviously going to spend most of the time breaking down the MLB trade deadline, which just passed about 2 hours ago. Buyers and sellers, who's hot, who's not. But no, we're excited to spend the next hour with you guys. Thank you everybody for tuning in. If you cannot tell from my voice, this will be my Michael Jordan flu game. He scored 38 points on that. So hopefully we can do the same. But David, we got some pretty big news about 2.5 hours ago that we've been digesting for the past 2.5 hours in preparation for this. What did Jack Smith have in store for us?
Or is it old news? So Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, was indicted yet again. Of course, the first indictment by New York, by Bragg and Manhattan. A lot of people quibbled with that. This is the second federal indictment, and of course, the first federal indictment was sort of replaced by what they call a superseding indictment. Right? They added more charges. So here we are, all kidding aside, with a fresh federal indictment having to do with the former president's alleged attempt to overturn the 2020 election, and he's being charged with a broad conspiracy, and there were, I believe, 6 co-conspirators in the indictment along with him. I'm going to allow Sarah Isgur and David French in a special advisory opinions, which drops tomorrow, so look for that, to really get into the legalese of all of this. What I'm going to say by way of talking about the politics is that, number one, there are parts of the indictment that read to somebody like me who's a layman when it comes to the law that were very compelling. And there were parts of it that read as though it were thin, or at the very least hard to prove. That's different than how it read to the layman in me, which is all there is in me when we're talking about legal stuff like this. When I read the indictment having to do with the alleged mishandling of classified documents, where you just seem to have one alleged crime after the other that was very easy to understand and make sense of, and that appeared as though there was criminal wrongdoing and an intent to commit criminal wrongdoing. The politics of this I'm pretty good at. And I think what we've discovered, and so I'm going to focus most of my attention there, Declan, I think what we have learned through one flimsy indictment in New York and one very, very, very compelling indictment in the Southern District of Florida, one local, one federal, is that indictments only help Donald Trump in the Republican primary. And I have seen nothing in the ensuing weeks from the previous indictments that suggest to me that somehow this is going to be different. In fact, this indictment probably strengthens him in the Republican primary. And if I were Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or Tim Scott or any other Republican running for president tonight, I'd be, from a political standpoint only, speaking in those terms, very upset that the former president was indicted. Now, this might sound to everybody at this point de rigueur, right? I mean, especially if you're watching Dispatch Live and you're one of our regulars, you care enough about politics, you're dialed in enough that you're like, oh yeah, I totally get it now. You've watched the Republican Party over the past year or so or longer, and you're like, okay, well, I'm disappointed about that maybe, or maybe I'm not, but that kind of makes sense to me. But think about it a minute. If we were to go back in time and jump in our hot tub time machine, even a decade, let alone 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, which I'm old enough to do and still be politically sentient, and you were to say that a leading candidate for president wasn't just indicted once, I'm going to pretend the New York indictment doesn't even exist. It was such a waste of time. My own editorializing. wasn't just indicted once on some pretty serious charges, but was indicted twice. And even though the second indictment, we could see parts of it that are compelling and parts of it that are not compelling, we'd say, oh, well, that candidate's toast. I mean, there's just no way they can survive, because all of the support that they have had from voters is going to dissipate, because the establishment of the party is going to say, thank you for your service. Here's a bronze watch. Get lost. I mean, it used to be, Declan, you may be too young to remember this, but when you were ousted after one term, they gave you a bronze watch, not a gold watch, even a bronze watch, and said, thank you for your service. Actually, I don't even know. Thank you. You lost. Get lost. But here we are in a situation where American politics is such, and the politics of the Republican Party is such, that this indictment only helps Donald Trump in his quest to win the Republican nomination. I don't say that with any judgment, but just as a matter of pure political analysis. I'll leave the judgment to others, because that's not what our founders pay me for. And I think that we have to look at the politics of the indictment in that way first and foremost, even though now we can pick around the edges and wonder what else it could mean and how else it might go wrong for Donald Trump down the line, potentially.
Right. And as you said, everybody should keep an eye out for tomorrow's special edition of Advisory Opinions. It won't be Thursday. It will be out a day early tomorrow to be able to address this, because the next, 18 minutes or so of this segment will be two guys without law degrees talking law. But the main gist, there were 4 charges brought down against Trump by Jack Smith, and the first had to do with kind of his effort to kind of curate these false slates of electors in states around the country that he lost, and replace them in the counting of the Electoral College votes on January 6th. There were charges related to kind of his effort to obstruct an official proceeding. That's obviously related to January 6th. And then an interesting kind of a civil rights charge that historically has been used in more recently been used in a lot of kind of voting rights and voting related cases, but historically was used to kind of go after members of the Ku Klux Klan, denying people of their civil rights, and kind of using extrajudicial means to do so. And so, especially on the first one and the slates of electors, it's going to hinge a lot on what Jack Smith and his team, the federal prosecutors, can prove about Trump's state of mind as he was kind of taking these orders, pushing people to do things that, he may or may not have believed true. In the indictment itself, they produced lots of evidence showing that people told Donald Trump that what he was saying is false, and that there's evidence to show that the election was not stolen, or at least there was not nearly enough fraud to make any meaningful difference in the outcome. Whether or not, Trump will be able to say, sure, they told me that, but I didn't believe them because they're wrong. I mean, that could be a perfectly legitimate defense on free speech grounds. So we'll have to see kind of what evidence there is there, if Smith and his team have recordings of Trump himself saying things behind closed doors that he was disputing publicly in terms of fair and not fair. So we have that. I want to get to a question from Mark that's related to this, but for you, David, about this whole, all these indictments and Trump's fundraising. That we've got some numbers in recent days about Trump and Trump PAC cash on hand being kind of surprisingly low, in large part due to all the legal bills that he's having to pay out. A lot of these lawyers, knowing his history on not necessarily making all of his contractors whole, have demanded money up front, large retainers that he has to pay out kind of immediately before they start to do work for him. So Mark is asking if other Republican candidates in the primary are making the case that a donation for Trump is a donation for his legal bills. Is that something that will be effective? Are voters upset about how their money's being used, and how big of an effect will Trump's low dollar totals have as he's campaigning here?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I mean, we don't necessarily know how voters may react down the line. I think what we know so far is I don't think we have any evidence that should lead us. I don't think there's any evidence to lead us to believe that voters sending Donald Trump's campaign money care how he spends it. I think they're sending him money because they want him to be president, because they think he's being unfairly persecuted, because they don't think he's doing anything wrong, or if he is doing anything wrong, everybody else does it wrong too, but they're only going after him. I mean, there are any number of reasons. I don't think people care. So I think they're happy to help him and are fine with him spending money any way that he can. I will say this, Declan, when you're Trump's got a dozen opponents, and only a couple of them actually try and make the case that what Trump has done is wrong and what he is doing is wrong, let's say with the money that's been donated to him or with his previous actions that led to these indictments. And so Trump says he did nothing wrong and he's being victimized. And a lot of the leading contenders for president other than Trump, or leading contenders to be second, they also say that Trump is being victimized and hasn't done anything wrong. And so if you're a Republican voter, here's what you're hearing. You're hearing Trump say, I did nothing wrong. And you're hearing other Republicans running against him. Even the Republicans running against him say he did nothing wrong and he's being victimized. Now, we've begun to, and so what would a voter think if that's all he or she is hearing? Well, every Republican, even the ones that want to beat him, won't say he's done anything wrong. I guess he hasn't done anything wrong. And so if you want your opponent to face some trouble for the things they're doing wrong, maybe you don't, there's an old saying in politics, if somebody's hanging themselves, leave them alone. Okay, maybe he's not hanging himself, as we've discussed, but fine, don't say anything, but you don't have to defend him as well as he defends himself. Now, we've seen some changes to this, right? We've seen Nikki Haley become a little bit more circumspect. We saw a statement from former Vice President Mike Pence tonight, really laying into Trump after this latest indictment. But we saw Ron DeSantis with a very defensive tweet on behalf of Trump, a statement via Twitter or via X, whatever I'm supposed to call it now. So I just don't think any of this stuff's really going to matter necessarily. But I do think if the Republicans running against him want it to matter, they ought to at least try to make it matter. Chris Christie tries to make it matter. Some of the other candidates that are underdogs and don't have a shot try to make it matter. But you really need a chorus of leading voices to make a case. Can it make a difference? I mean, I'm dubious, but it's they're going to have a better chance trying than not trying.
Obviously, January 6th is not a topic that Republican candidates besides Trump seem to want to bring up on their own or talk about. You have kind of a fringe of the Republican conference in Congress who have made kind of the January 6th political prisoners a main focus of theirs. But among the candidates themselves, they don't bring it up preemptively. They deflect if they're asked any questions about it. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago when DeSantis faced a question about January 6th, his response was essentially, I wasn't there that day. I was in Florida, which, okay, that doesn't necessarily provide any insight into how you believe the people that day were behaving. But it's obviously going to be, everybody's going to get questions about it. Everybody's going to be forced to talk about it again. Who benefits potentially most from this being the issue? I mean, you could say it's Mike Pence, that, this was his defining moment of probably his career. And we saw he put out that statement that you referenced earlier, which I'll pull up and read. But who do you think this being kind of the main topic of conversation for the next couple of days or weeks benefits?
I mean, honestly, the person who benefits the most is Donald Trump, because it gives him an establishment to fight against. And it's another reason why Republican voters cling to him, is because they can't picture a bigger fighter against the machine and the man that they don't like than Donald Trump. The Justice Department comes after him with federal indictments, and it's like he welcomes it. And so I think all of this, he's the only one that wants to talk about it, and you can't benefit from something you don't want to talk about. Now, Chris Christie has been very consistent on this in this campaign, and it could benefit him to the degree that he gets a lot of attention for saying things other Republicans don't want to say. And of course, he knows how to, he's good at getting media attention, which for his long shot campaign is something he needs. I think that Mike Pence, this is one area where since his campaign began, he's been rather consistent about speaking about what he did on January 6th, not just making a affirmative case for what he did and making an argument against his former boss. And so it doesn't hurt him. You know, I understand, look, Republican candidates feel like they're in a bind, right? Because you have a portion of the Republican electorate that was disgusted by January 6th, and they want a Republican to speak out against it and to say that it was wrong and to say that it shouldn't have happened and to say that the politician they hold responsible for that shouldn't be president again. Then you have a portion of the Republican electorate that was bothered by January 6th, but they don't want to talk about it anymore. They want to talk about the future. They don't necessarily want to listen to people criticizing a president they thought did a pretty good job, that they accept lost, even if it was an unfair loss. But they just don't want to feel like they're being lectured about the fact that they supported a bad guy. And then you have a portion of the Republican electorate that is very supportive of Donald Trump, do not think he did anything wrong, largely believe his claims that the election was stolen. Or if they quibble with that, it's only that, well, it was such an unfair election, it might as well have been stolen, even though technically it wasn't stolen. And I think too many Republican candidates look at these buckets and they keep trying to find a way to thread the needle. And I think in the era that we're in, voters generally, whether you're for Trump or against Trump, by the way, whether you're a Democrat, center left, or very left, you don't want people to spin. You just want them to tell you what they think. They want to hear from politicians. What do you really think? And they're more likely to give you a pass if you're just honest and upfront and authentic than if you try and bob and weave. And I think too many of the Republican candidates, when this topic comes up, just bob and weave instead of just saying, you know what, it was horrible, it was awful. That's one of the reasons I'm running against him. Now let's talk about the future. I'm sick of litigating the past. Republican voters don't want to hear that. They want to know how I'm going to make their lives better. I'll have plenty to say about Trump when I meet him on the debate stage, right? Like that. There are ways to handle it. I'm just a color commentator in the cheap seats, but bobbing and weaving doesn't work. And every time you hear somebody like Ron DeSantis say, well, gee, I wasn't there. Come on, dude. Like, most of us weren't there. We all had opinions about it. Just tell us your opinion. And if you don't think it was so bad, just say so. And you may lose some voters. You may gain some voters. But you end up in this no man's land. I could criticize a whole bunch of Republicans for trying to bob and weave about it. And just move on. But you know who doesn't bob and weave? Donald Trump. Donald Trump tells everybody, what he thinks or what he wants us to think he thinks. I guess Jack Smith will get to that at trial. And Republican voters look at that guy. He's just telling it like it is. That's what he thinks. He's not bobbing and weaving, and he's able to hold on to his loyal base in part because of that. So I don't know who this helps, because most of them don't want to take this issue head on. And by the way, if they took it head on, they could dispose of it. Like, you've got a ready answer. I mean, how many times do I have to tell you, Declan, January 6th was really bad and Donald Trump did a really bad thing. Next, I'm here to talk about my plan for, combating China and dealing, making our economy better. Move on, but they won't do it.
Right. That's one surefire way to make sure you keep getting asked the question over and over again, is to not answer it.
That's what we do, right? If you bob and weave, what do we keep doing? But sir, answer the question. But ma'am, answer the question. And then in the next interview, I guess I'll ask it again because they really didn't tell my competitor. They didn't give him an answer. Maybe I'll get an answer. And you keep going at it and at it. What do we not bug candidates about? I mean, will you tell me for the umpteenth time about your plan to combat inflation? Like, I don't need to ask you about that.
Stuff you want to talk about. Yeah.
You've been very clear. No, but it's not just that. You've been very clear about it. There's
Yeah.
nothing more for me to get. What else can I ask you about? It doesn't even have to be unfair. It could just be like, all right, tell me about growing up and playing Little League. Tell me something where people are going to feel like they're reading something new in my story. So whenever you avoid these difficult questions, there's always a chance that I'm going to be the guy that makes you crack. And so I'm going to keep asking it.
Right. You mentioned earlier the campaigns that I was not around for, 92, George or HW not winning a second term. I was around for 2016. And I remember some of this, similar dynamics playing out where these candidates would bob and weave. And then all of a sudden they get desperate and they start to tell you what they really think, or at least what, you can remember Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz going at Trump in, I think it was a March 2016 debate where con man and the whole thing about the hand size. And they start finally bringing up all these things that they've been keeping to themselves for the past 8 months. Do you think, is there a point where, these candidates, the other 11 in the race, start to get that desperate? And is it not going to come until March of 2024? Do you think they're holding it for the first debate? When does that moment come?
So I think that, notwithstanding what I just said about the January 6th topic, in fairness, the Republican candidates, a lot of them have been critical of Trump on issues. It may not work, but they're at least doing the only thing that could possibly work. Right? Nikki Haley has been really critical of Donald Trump when it comes to China. Ron DeSantis has been really critical of Donald Trump when it comes to his handling of COVID. Mike Pence has been really critical of Donald Trump when it comes to spending and fiscal issues. So we have seen candidates in the past 6 to 8 weeks slowly but surely treat Trump like they would treat any one of themselves. We just haven't seen it make a dent. And the one candidate that had some momentum at the outset of his campaign, Ron DeSantis, has lately faded into a very weak second place in the race. I tell you, I was, in Iowa when a couple of weeks before he launched, and then when he launched, and the crowds and the enthusiasm and the interest, they were all extremely high. Now he's playing more of this small ball, long game, and he's had to retool his campaign. We'll see if he can get back to where he was. But Ron DeSantis has faded from the strong second place he was in at the beginning to a weak second place, and nobody has really supplanted him or even shown signs of real momentum. I mean, Vivek Ramaswamy has shown some momentum in some national polls, but literally the other day, I had an operative supporting a candidate who did a somersault because they had made it into 1 or 2% in the poll, which represented potential debate qualifications for the first Republican debate coming up August 23rd in Milwaukee. And I just thought to myself, like, look, this is where this race is at, where people are patting themselves on the back for being somewhat viable because they're in the low single digits. And so I just think that we are seeing the candidates learn from their mistakes or their colleagues' mistakes in 2016. Chris Christie's been very open about, how he was so focused on becoming the consensus alternative to Trump in the so-called establishment lane in 2016. He never criticized the guy that was actually winning the race, which was Trump. So now he focuses on Trump exclusively, almost, because that's the guy who's winning. So we do see differences. We just don't yet see anything having an effect. Now, maybe over time, it will have an effect. And I hate certainty in politics. I hate fighting the last war. 8 years ago, Trump couldn't win. All of a sudden, Trump can't lose. But he's in a very strong position. And I think these other candidates are trying to figure out, the best way to move ahead. I think the debates can help. I think the fact that eventually some candidates will run out of money or run out of enough steam that they will drop out of the race, leaving, fewer candidates, could change the dynamic. But these indictments, I just think have been very difficult, because what do you do when you're, I was joking about this a couple of weeks ago, I think, with Kevin Williamson. It's like, wow, Ron DeSantis should have known that when Donald Trump was indicted 3 times, that it would have a net negative impact on his, campaign. I mean, what do you do when somebody gets indicted and their numbers go up? Like Ron DeSantis, just to use him as an easy example, has done plenty wrong, but he's not responsible for Trump's numbers going up after Trump got indicted, for Trump raising more money after he's got indicted. It's not like, DeSantis got the sugar high after the Trump indictment and then lost it. Trump's numbers went up, and then they went up again. And so I figure, maybe he can't get beyond 55%. Because he's exhausted the pool of voters that'll support him, indicted or not indicted. But how do you deal with that? I don't think anybody really knows. I don't think any professional Republican who understands the base, who isn't, bubbled up here and doesn't know what's going on, who totally gets it, can really figure out yet what to do. And that's, and maybe part of that is that so far Republican voters either are not dialed in enough or just don't find anybody compelling enough to make them think twice about, the quasi-incumbent in the race.
Maybe we'll get 10 candidates sprinting down to Fulton County, Georgia, pleading with the DA not to bring her indictment.
Honestly, that's what I would do. I would totally do that. I would beg and plead.
If you care. Yeah. Well, that's a good transition point to bring in our third panelist, Audrey Fallberg, I believe, is here. Yes, she is. Welcome. We were just talking about candidates not being able to figure out how to break through. And you've been doing some reporting on one of those leading candidates, the now soft second, as Drucker said, Ron DeSantis, who's on his third or fourth different style of reset of the campaign. Kind of, can you provide an update to viewers of what he's been up to and whether it's working so far?
Sure, absolutely. The one thing I will add to your Trump indictment conversation, which I think was really, really great and enlightening, is that, you guys had a lot of conversation about how Trump has really mastered the art of being the victim in the political conversation, but he's also mastered the art of being the bully at the same exact time. And nobody else in the field has figured out how to kind of thread that needle. And so I think that is just kind of been the thing that's been holding his polling lead so steady over the past few months. And just with this Trump indictment news, it's so funny. I'm taking this Zoom call from my sister's apartment because I'm moving this week. So I apologize for the decorations in the back. But, I was explaining what we were talking about, the Trump indictment news. She was like, wait, he was indicted again? Wasn't he indicted 2 days ago? And I was like, no, that was a superseding indictment. And she's a very well-informed voter. So I think that just really perfectly captures how confusing a lot of this legal jargon is, even for really well-informed voters. But yes, Ron DeSantis, as you mentioned, he's on his third or fourth campaign reset, reboot, whatever you want to call it. It's hard to keep track. But yeah, in recent weeks, he's gotten a lot of attention for, the fact that he's kind of been sagging in the polls, despite the millions and millions of dollars his super PAC Never Back Down has spent kind of boosting him in advertising. A lot of that has been really dedicated toward voter contact in early states as well. I think it was a week or two ago, they fired 38 staffers, which is about more than a third of the campaign staff, huge number. And one of those is a former speechwriter who had kind of retweeted a video that included a fascist symbol in it. But new reporting that came out this week showed that a lot of his senior aides had actually overseen this kind of high-risk, strange strategy where DeSantis staffers would create these kind of like meme videos. I don't really know how to explain them. And this, you should look them up after this Dispatch Live, but just kind of like meme videos with like, kind of strange looking memes. And then all these like kind of weird symbols that are just kind of indicative of like how online online the new right kind of vibe of his staff is. But senior aides had like overseen this strategy where DeSantis staffers would create these kind of cringe, strange videos and then give them to anonymous Twitter accounts. And then DeSantis staffers would retweet them, essentially pretending like they didn't create the accounts and the videos, excuse me. So it's been in the news all this week, and Republican donors are like, what the heck is going on? And I'll kick it over to you, Drucker, but it's just been kind of overwhelming, like how chaotic this has been, given he, has been in the second place for months now. And, so many Republicans were just kind of ready and eager to get behind him because he, won his most recent election by 20 something points. And right now his campaign seems to be floundering.
Drucker, we got a poll from the New York Times this week. It was their first one of the cycle that showed, if you believe the findings, that the DeSantis team made a pretty bad bet, focusing almost entirely on fighting wokeness, waging the culture war, that it's really the economy that voters want to hear candidates talk about. They want to hear. They see the culture war stuff as important, but it shouldn't be the driving ethos of a campaign. That comes out yesterday. We also, coincidentally, DeSantis launches his economic policy in a speech this week. The timing may or may not be coincidental. Before, I think we've talked about one or two of these DeSantis resets on Dispatch Live before, but they were less substantive, more about kind of messaging and who they were going to, which outlets they were going to talk to, kind of engage with the mainstream media more. Are we seeing an actual more substantive reset or pivot to a different issue set, a different way to differentiate himself from the rest of the field?
I don't know if he's differentiating himself from the rest of the field. He has made changes, right? So although it was slow to develop this change in media engagement strategy to talk more to both mainstream outlets and journalists, but also just, people that are going to give them tough questions, substantive questions, and not just a bunch of, friendlies, has happened. It took a while. After the Jake Tapper interview, it was about 10 days, but then he spoke to Ed O'Keefe at CBS News, very good reporter. Yesterday, he spoke to Brett Baer, host of Special Report on Fox News, very good reporter.
Apparently Brett Baer had been pushing for that interview for months, and the DeSantis campaign didn't even want to do that on Fox.
And the same with Megyn Kelly. She had asked for months for an interview, and he didn't.
Right, and her interview reminded me of the Megyn Kelly I remember from Fox, a very substantive, very tough but fair interview. Ron DeSantis actually does better. He comes off better in these interviews and ends up with fewer problems than when he's talking to friendlies. That's how he got himself wrapped in that RFK Jr. mess. So the media engagement strategy is happening. This, the pivot to policy white paper speeches about the economy and foreign policy. I mean, every candidate does that at some point. I don't know if that's a pivot. I think, the pivot that they're talking about that we have seen is and it's probably difficult because he's the sitting governor of a very large state, and his office is in Tallahassee, which isn't easy to get in and out of. Trust me, I've tried. Is that he's spending more time on the trail. He is not just giving speeches from behind lecterns, but beginning to do town halls. He's gaggling more with reporters, which in the early states will include local and national, and local's very important there. He's mingling more with voters. He's doing more town hall style events. And so he has pivoted, and, he's doing events with voters. Some are intimate and small, some are, larger. He's pledged to do, what we call the full Grassley in Iowa, which every year Senator Chuck Grassley, who is 89 years old and will outlive everybody, hits all 99 Iowa counties. So it's become the thing of legend every single year. He's been in office since 1823. So that's a long time. And so he's pledged to do the full Grassley, which means you're going to go to some of these towns. And I've done it before with candidates, and you're going to get, if you're lucky, 24 people, because only, 600 live there. And, I'm sure somebody will criticize that, but that's what you have to do if you're going to win. Okay, so he's doing all these things that are different. Is the messaging different? I don't know that the messaging is all that different. Sometimes the emphasis is different. They told me that they were going to be very future oriented, less about what he did in Florida and more about here's what I'm going to do as president, and just kind of keep it focused there. He does that sometimes. Sometimes he gets caught in the Florida vortex, but he's trying to show his bona fides by saying, you can trust me to do all this because look what I did. I think the woke stuff and the cultural issues in some ways it can be both an unfair criticism and a fair criticism. I have been critical of the governor's strategy in that he had an opportunity to coalesce a broad cross-section of the Republican electorate. That means peeling off some Trump voters, but getting the majority of voters that were looking beyond Trump for any sort of reason, and also just we're never going to vote for Trump, but really want to find a Republican they can support. And instead, his messaging at times seems to have focused solely on Trump voters, as though he was trying to just take Trump's electorate and make it his own. I think that's been a mistake. But when you talk about cultural issues in places like Iowa and South Carolina, and Iowa goes first and it's huge, it wasn't necessarily a bad bet or the wrong strategy to focus a lot on that, because a lot of what caucus goers, which are a smaller subset of a Republican electorate than just a normal primary electorate, a lot of what they care about are going to be where you are on some of these key cultural issues. So it's not necessarily a loser from that perspective. But I think one of the reasons he's become a weak second is there are a lot of Republicans that thought, okay, if you're the guy to beat Trump, I can get on board, even if I'm not sure I like you, but just give me something. Give me a pretzel, just give me something. And it sounded like he was focused on appealing only to Trump voters who are already going to be with Trump because Trump's Trump, versus, kind of like Trump, I think we need fresh leadership, or, oh my God, I used to like Trump, but after January 6th, forget it. Or, I never liked Trump, but I really don't want to vote for Biden again, or I really want to be able to vote. And I just want somebody that makes, that works for me in that regard. And I think that's where he's missed an opportunity so far.
Audrey, that tees us up well for a transition to some other stuff that you've been working on. The NRSC is trying to thread a similar needle where they need to win they need to bring along the broadest swath of Republican voters in with the candidates that they're choosing. And there are those different factions that Drucker just laid out. There are the 10 to 20%, depending on which poll you believe, of the people who really want to move on from Trump, the 30 to 50% who really want to stay with Trump, depending on the poll that you believe, and then the rest in the middle who could take it or leave it, depending on the day. And Republican candidates need to attract all of those. So what is the NRSC trying to do to make sure that they avoid a repeat of 2022?
Yeah, so the NRSC, which is essentially Senate Republicans' campaign arm, is being chaired this cycle by Steve Daines. He's a Republican from Montana. It's really important to remember that he's taken the helm after a pretty disastrous midterm cycle under the leadership of Rick Scott from Florida, who didn't really invest that much time or effort into candidate recruitment. And so he's kind of widely credited, if you want to use that term, for a pretty lackluster Senate Republican midterm cycle, when the initial forecast had been that it would be a red wave. So Steve Daines has put a huge primer on candidate recruitment and really trying to draw in, especially like really deep-pocketed candidates who he thinks will be really viable in general election campaigns. So with that said, Steve Daines made a lot of headlines a few months ago, and he decided to endorse Trump, right? That was seen as kind of a controversial move, right? Because he's one of the most important high-profile Republicans, especially this cycle. But, for now, it seems like it's been kind of a smart strategy because it was clearly done with the intent of kind of, we're backing you, Trump, so you got to back the people that we recruit to run in these races. And so, they've succeeded in bringing, what they see as strong candidates into races in West Virginia with Governor Jim Justice, this businessman Tim Sheehy in Montana. But there are a couple other states where they haven't found recruits yet, or where the field hasn't really shaped up. Michigan, Wisconsin, but also Pennsylvania. And tomorrow in Dispatch Politics, our newsletter, we have a fun story just about how a couple months ago in Pittsburgh, Steve Daines was speaking before an audience of really deep-pocketed Republican donors in Pittsburgh at an NRSC fundraiser, and was literally begging the audience to pick up their phones and call Dave McCormick and his wife and like plea with him to jump into the Senate race in Pennsylvania, because they think he's just such a strong candidate and they're really just eager to retake the Senate. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether Trump does get super involved in Republican Senate primaries this cycle, because that was a problem for Senate Republicans in 2022.
In Pennsylvania in particular, Doug Mastriano, who was widely presumed, he was the gubernatorial candidate in Pennsylvania in 2022. He was at the Capitol on January 6th, pretty far out there in terms of his support for Trump and Trump post 2020. Said that he's not going to run for the Senate this year. That kind of rolls out the red carpet for McCormick if he wants it, because he was a very, very close second place to Dr. Oz the last cycle. Drucker, are you hearing anything? It's my impression that he plans to get in the race, but that just might be my assumption based on.
No, it's not your assumption.
Yeah.
Well, it may be your assumption, but your assumption is correct. He intends to run. He's planning to run. Since he lost the primary to Mehmet Oz in 2022, it was a very narrow loss. If you recall, it went into overtime. There were some recounts. McCormick fell just short. He stayed involved with the party. He is from the Pittsburgh area, real sort of middle-class roots, if I recall. Hadn't lived there in a long time, made a boatload of cash working for a hedge fund. I mean, also a military veteran. He's got a very impressive resume. So he comes back to Pennsylvania, runs for Senate after Sean Parnell drops out, who was who would have been endorsed by Trump and was a good candidate. So oftentimes when you get candidates like this, if it doesn't go their way, they scurry back to Connecticut or Florida or wherever they really live or want to live. But David McCormick has stayed. Been involved with the party, so he set himself up to run and have the party behind him. And having done it once before, probably will be a better candidate than he was the last time. He'd never run for anything before. Drove around the state in his pickup and did all the right stuff, but probably be more comfortable in his skin this time around. So I think we're all expecting him to run. Audrey runs point for us on this, but we're all expecting him to run. I think he'll be a very strong candidate. It's a tough race. Bob Casey is a good candidate. He's not the most dynamic person, but he's won some tough races in Pennsylvania. And his father was a very popular elected official in Pennsylvania years ago. And so, Republicans are hoping he gets into the race. They should hope he gets into the race. And one thing, that McCormick has is he won't lack for money. I think he was willing to spend it on his primary last time around. I think he'll be willing to write himself a really big check in the general election in 2024 if he's the nominee. And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we should mention he was he served in the military, but then was a hedge fund executive for several years, and his wife worked in the Trump administration. He kind of checked all the boxes in terms of what you'd want in an ideal candidate, but Trump just liked Dr. Oz more, and McCormick lost by, I think it was less than a percentage point, despite
950
a week of negative attacks from Trump himself leading up to the primary. We have to move on relatively soon, but Audrey, before you go, there was some more news today out of Wisconsin, one of the states that you mentioned, that Representative Tom Tiffany, a Republican, is also not going to run for Senate there. Mike Gallagher, another representative who's leading the China Commission the committee on Select Committee on China in this Congress, also has opted not to run for the Senate. Why is it so difficult for Republicans to find somebody to take on the Democrat up there.
Because Tammy Baldwin is a really, really strong candidate. And if you read Dispatch Politics, you'd know that Scott Walker also agrees. We talked to him a couple weeks ago, and he was talking to us about how, she's just going to be tough to beat. She shows up when all the other Republicans show up to events. She's really good at, attracting support from, dairy farmers and just like threading the needle and just being a really strong candidate. But yeah, I mean, Mike Gallagher was widely considered Senate Republicans' strongest potential recruit. He flirted with it a little bit, but opted to not run. That flirtation with running for even like a week when this NRSC released polling showing that he would perform really well against her, which I'm sure his team was probably involved in, though he hasn't said as much. Kind of signals that he probably wants his name out there so that he can run for governor or Senate in a couple of years. But yeah, Tom Tiffany is not running. Eric Hovde is this really, rich real estate developer in Wisconsin who ran for Senate in 2012 and did not win, obviously. But he might run. But yeah, I mean, Senate Republicans are kind of having a tricky time recruiting candidates there, and I think. It obviously matters, but I think that their main focus is recruiting strong candidates and being all in states like Ohio, West Virginia, Montana, states that Trump won handily in 2020. And with such a narrow majority, they only have to flip a couple seats. So,
yes, we've got. I keep saying we have a long way to go, but less and less as we go. I mean, the primaries are going to get started very early next year, so we will. Be reading along in Dispatch Politics, and everybody who's watching should be subscribed to that. What do you guys have coming in tomorrow's, aside from the McCormick nugget, if you can give a preview?
We'll have some stuff on the indictment, and then Drucker has something on fill in the blank.
Oh, just some details on the super PAC supporting Nikki Haley is going to begin running ads over the next 9 weeks in Iowa and New Hampshire. They raised a good bit of money and entered July. This super PAC did SFA Fund Inc. with $17 million in cash on hand. So they're not going to let it collect interest. They're going to start spending digital, broadcast, cable. It'll be all over TV in Iowa, New Hampshire. So we'll see if it helps her move the needle at all.
Great. Eric, there is your Nikki Haley mention. He was a commenter who was wondering if we were going to bring her up. Well, thank you both for joining us. We are going to do a fun, there's not really a way to segue between what we were just talking about, what we're about to talk about, but
it's really the same topic. It's just aliens and weird, as George W. Bush would say, it's some weird, yes. But it's a family show.
We're all feeling, you made me say it in my head. That's just the same. Thanks, guys.
Take care. Great.
Mary, hello. How are you?
Oh, well, how are you?
Thank you for joining us. We have there's 10 or so minutes left. We can get a little weird at the end of Dispatch Live. It's August. It's a weird month. So we decided this morning, well, we decided a couple days ago, but this morning we ran your piece on the UFO/UAP hearing in Congress last week. I mean, my inclination was to kind of see how it plays out and then cover it. But then I was like, if there does end up being aliens and we just ignored it, that would look, it's more of a
bad look.
Yeah. So we covered it. Why don't you let the viewers know? My understanding is there were 3 people testifying. Some of them seemed a little bit more credible than the rest. What were your takeaways from the hours?
Yeah, so it was about a 2.5-hour hearing in the House Oversight Committee on Wednesday, a subcommittee of that committee. And there were 3 witnesses giving testimony, 2 Davids and a Ryan. David Grush, who was a so-called whistleblower. He's a self-proclaimed whistleblower who says he has evidence of a multi-decade cover-up of sort of a recovery and reverse engineering program of UAP, so unidentified aerial / anomalous, depending on who you ask, phenomena. which is what you and I know as UFOs. So that's Grush, and we'll sort of put parentheses around him and come back to him in a second. And then there are two former Navy pilots, both of whom have personal experience with UFOs. So we have David Fravor, who is a retired Navy pilot, who says he saw what he describes as a tic-tac-like UFO off the coast of San Diego in 2004. And then you have Ryan Graves, who is also a former Navy pilot, who founded the Americans for Safe Aerospace group, which advocates for reporting these sightings from both military and commercial pilots. And so Ryan Graves says that he saw a gray cube inside of a clear sphere in 2014. And so that's sort of his story. And he's been an advocate for a way to report those sightings.
I think there were a whole bunch of reasons why this hearing took place, from concerns about government transparency about these issues to just kind of I'm sure some lawmakers are just genuinely curious. Some want to have stuff for social media and fundraising clips.
It was the end of July.
Yes. Kind of, what was your sense of, were the lawmakers taking this seriously? Was it kind of a, let's just do this to have fun, or what do you get the vibe as?
Yeah, I mean, it was it sort of depended. They were remarkably bipartisan. There weren't as many Democrats who showed up to the hearing, but at the same time, there were also plenty of Republicans and plenty of agreement from Republicans and Democrats that there was more transparency needed, that there was unanswered questions. This has been a bipartisan issue for a couple of years. It's been gathering steam. And really, if you want to take it at its most serious reading, then it was about making sure pilots are safe and making sure that if they see something they can't explain or don't understand, they have a way to report that to keep people safe. So that's the most generous reading. I think there were some potential credibility issues with the whistleblower, but I think Graves especially was making the point, we need to know what the government knows, what the Pentagon knows, so that we can tell pilots, commercial and military, about that.
Sweet. Well, we just got breaking news off the transom that we have a ABC News correspondent / Dispatch podcast host who is available for a couple minutes to answer some questions about the other big news from earlier tonight. Mary, we will come back to UFOs, but Sarah, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello. We are just about to pre-tape Nightline, so that's why I can't stay too long. So everyone gets a little behind the scenes shot at that. You missed me putting on my lipstick, though. Thankfully, y'all promoted me after I'd already gotten the lipstick on.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, so we'll get right to it. Drucker and I spent 15-20 minutes talking about kind of the politics of the charges with a little bit of the legalese, but we wanted to save that for you and David. So how serious are these charges to start?
Okay, so this is I can't think of a bigger case that the Department of Justice has ever brought in its history. They are charging a former president with trying to overturn an election to stay in power. So from that sense, there's nothing bigger, there's nothing more serious, all the things. However, compared to the Florida indictment, that one's a straight shot in terms of the elements that you have to prove and in terms of the evidence that they have. This is going to be a trial about Donald Trump's state of mind. And I find that to be a little discomforting because, in short, they are going to have to relitigate every election fraud claim from 2020, at least every one that could have changed the outcome of any of the states in question. They're going to have to disprove all of them. And that won't be enough, because then they're going to have to show that Donald Trump also didn't believe that those claims were still true. Now, they lay out all these people who told Donald Trump that this thing wasn't true. And actually these people weren't dead and all of this stuff. That's not enough that your attorney general told you it wasn't true, and your White House and your national security director, all of those things. They have to prove that Donald Trump actually believed it, believed that they weren't true and still went out and did it anyway. I just don't love that from a trial perspective. That's a really high bar to clear. And all of the charges that they brought, there's 4 charges, but there's 3 different statutes implicated. All of those charges have a lot of history behind them in terms of the intent and the mental state that you have to prove, one of which is currently being litigated at the DC Circuit. That's the January 6th charge, in which case you have to prove that Trump acted corruptly. What does corruptly mean? Well, that's a good question. There's a split of whether it means you have to know the thing you were doing was illegal, or simply know that you were doing the thing. Does that make sense of the difference?
I think so.
Yeah, so let me give you a better example from a different charge that's in this. So under 18 U.S.C. 241, which everyone knows by heart, obviously, you have to prove specific intent. So, for instance, specific intent to prevent someone from being able to use their constitutional rights. Let's say that I rob you, Declan, and I assault you while doing it, whatever. I'm like a mean person. In one version of this, I did it for the money. You cannot charge me with a federal crime because I robbed you and assaulted you for the money. But let's say you were on your way to vote. And actually, I robbed you and assaulted you because I wanted to intimidate you so that you wouldn't go vote. Well, that's now my intent question. Was I intending to take just the money? I just wanted the money and I didn't even know you were on your way to vote, or didn't care that you were on your way to vote. Or my intent wasn't to take the money. I didn't need the money. It was to prevent you, Declan, from voting because I knew you were going to vote for someone I didn't like. They're going to have to do that with all of this around Donald Trump. So you see why that's kind of a mess.
Right. And in the indictment itself, they lay out, here's a time where somebody Donald Trump should have trusted told him that it was false. And here's another time where somebody else Donald Trump should have trusted and can Trump just be like, yeah, but I didn't believe him. So
I believed the crazy person and I didn't believe my attorney general.
Right. So
if the jury believes him, as in believes that Donald Trump didn't believe his attorney general, that's the ball game on most of this.
Right.
I want to put a little asterisk there on the false electors, the fake slate of electors, because that one's a little different. If they can prove that Donald Trump actually directed the false slate of electors. But unfortunately, in the indictment, all it says is under the defendant's direction. But we don't actually see any evidence of the defendant's direction. So anyway, sorry that this is so short. We will have a full emergency podcast about this tomorrow. David and I are beefing up tonight. We're going crazy. We're sending all our text messages back and forth. We're going to have pretty different takes on this too. So if you want the slightly rosier picture, that'll be David. I'll be negative Nancy. We all have a good night. Have fun, Declan.
Good luck. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
So that's a good preview for everybody who is eagerly awaiting the advisory opinions take on it. We've just got a couple minutes left. I think Mary is still hanging around in cyberspace somewhere. She's back. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but let's just, the last couple minutes here, we've got a fun question from Paul that neither of us are going to have an actual answer to, but let's just kind of bandy about. Legally speaking, if I discover a crashed UFO on my property, can I claim it and gain property rights, assuming the owners don't make a claim against me?
I have lots of questions about the question, which is like, are you asking for a friend? Like, do you have a UFO and now you're wanting my legal advice because you just missed the lawyer? You should ask.
This is too specific for a hypothetical.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, what odds would you put on us learning about the existence of what did one of the people say, non-human biologics?
Biologics, yeah.
Do you think we have more hard evidence of non-human biologics by 2028?
I mean, that's kind of a long time horizon. I would say if we do, it's not because David Grush turned up new evidence. It's probably because science did its thing, and we have new evidence that, you know, maybe there's an amoeba out there on Mars or something. But I mean, yeah, to sort of square the circle on Grush, he is this whistleblower who claims to have not firsthand evidence, but secondhand evidence that there's this conspiracy, that we have non-human biologics. He implied in a question from Nancy, in a response to a question from Nancy Mace, that we had potentially alien pilots, ? But all of his answers were caveated with, I can't discuss that fully unless I have a classified venue to do it. Congress is out of session. The Pentagon has already swatted down a lot of what he said as patently false, if you believe them. So, you know, whether or not they get that classified setting, not clear, but the two members of Congress who are leading the charge on this are kind of like dog to the bone on this. They are very excited that this is something they get to do. And so I think we'll probably hear more about it, but I don't know if that will actually turn up any evidence. But I certainly hope that Congress is not going to be responsible for deciding if we have aliens or not. If that is the case, then we are in much bigger trouble than just having little green men floating around the stratosphere.
We got a comment. I forget who it actually was. So if it was you, feel free to send a note in the chat. But we got a good comment in TMD this morning that the best case against aliens, or the government having information on aliens, is that Donald Trump would have blurted it out within 2 days of taking office and learning about it. So
that's probably accurate. Yeah.
So I think we might be in the clear for now. That might not hold true in perpetuity, but thank you for your service sitting through that hearing and deciding fact from fiction. So, and thank you to everybody who tuned in for this hour. It was a little all over the place, but I think it ended up being a good hour, and we hope to see many of you right back here same time next week.
Good night, everyone.